So now we're going to talk about font size. And for font size, there's a couple of rules that you need to follow. So if you look at like the documentation, there's all kinds of different settings you could use for font size. You could use small, medium, large, blah, blah, blah. You could use larger or smaller. You could use ems, rims, VH, VW, percentage, and there's even more, right? You could use even more stuff. We've been using pixels up to this point in the course. We've been like, hey, make this 10 pixels, 12 pixels, 32, 128 pixels, whatever. And that changes the size of the font. From this point forward, we are going to use rim. All right, we'll use rim, and occasionally it's okay to use VW. Okay, so we'll sometimes use VW, but that's what we're using from this point forward in the course. So let me show you why rim and why VW, and then I'll explain a little bit about why we're using those as opposed to pixels or ems or any of this other nonsense over here. So we're here in 025, 03 font size, and I have 01 rim. I'm going to open this up and then right click main CSS and split vertically, and then move this over a little so that I have that on one line. So originally we were doing things like 16 pixels. And when I previewed this in the browser, and I started with pixels because pixels are really common and a lot of people use pixels. All right, so I thought I'd just start with pixels, and we'll learn at some point what a pixel is. Not important right now. When we get to something else, viewport, when we get to viewport, we'll learn about pixels and all that. All right, so here, if I right click and inspect this page, I could see that my style, I set a font size to 16 pixels, and then there's this computed tab, and I click here and it says 16 pixels. Well, I could change this to one rim and then refresh this page, and font size is one rim and computed is 16 pixels. So what a rim stands for is a root M, and M as in the letter M, because way back in the Stone Ages when they did typography with metal letters that they positioned onto a tray and then pressed ink on top of it and pressed paper on top of that, they would measure the size of the font by how wide was the letter M. And so they now call those M's. And we are using one M, which is relative to the root. Well, what is the root? The root is the browser's default font size setting. So if I go into my browser, go into settings, go to web content, and click on customize fonts, at least in Google Chrome, this is how you see it. I can see here that I have a font size of 16 pixels as my default. So it's really encouraged to use rim as opposed to pixel, because rim is going to scale proportionally with the user's default font size. And if the user has gone out of their way to learn this thing about how to change the default font size on their computer, it's probably because they have accessibility issues and they can't read it at 16 pixels and they want to make it bigger. And so this will keep all of your fonts proportional to each other. You know, this big one and this little bit smaller subheading, right? That's all going to be proportional if they've changed their root, because you'll say, hey, this is 2 rim, this is 1 rim. So if I did have 2 rim, let me just show you that. That would be 32 pixels. And so you can see the computed styles, 2 rim, and give me 2 times 16 is 32. I could do decimals. I could do 1.5. That's going to be 24. 1.5 times 16 is 24. So that's what you want to use from this point forward is rim. All right. Occasionally, special use case, you will use VW. And VW is a viewport width. And so some people say don't use VW because when you go to can I use, right, and you say can I use VW, plus it's just cool to say because it's also a car, it only supported in 84% of browsers. But if you look at what the issues are, okay, IE8, you're living in the Ozarks. You're like backwoods, hillbilly. You need to upgrade your browser, or you're a like government employee. Don't worry about it. It's only 0.63% of the market. Those people probably don't have money to buy what you're selling anyhow. Don't worry about it. So here we have this, and it says partial support. And if you look at the bottom part of that little flyout, partial support refers to not supporting VMAX. Cool, we're not using Vmax, we're using VW. Because when you look up VW in MDN's documentation, it's like, here are the different viewport width settings, including Vmax. We're not going to use Vmax, we're only using VW. So, VW totally works, and here's what VW does. I'm going to preview this page. And so basically, VW stands for viewport width. And they say there's 100 of these VW units from left to right on any screen. And so if I say give me 4 of them, it's giving me 4 out of 100 of this screen's width. So it's kind of a proportional thing. And as I change the width of the screen, the font size changes. And so that's really useful when you want to have a big banner chunk of text across an image, and that's just like the center of the page. But as the page changes, I want the font size to change. Use VW. All right, so you want to use RIM 99% of the time. Sometimes you'll use VW. Now the reason we like RIM is it's relative to the default font size, which means the root font size. And then some of this other stuff, we don't like it because it's relative to the parent. Like larger, smaller is relative to the parent, M is relative to the parent, percentage is relative to the parent, and relative to the parent, there's a special use case where that makes sense. If you're building a component like a web component and you want the font sizes to be relative to each other, cool, relative to the parent will make sense in that special use case scenario. Like high-end web component stuff, don't worry about it for now. We want relative to the root. Relative to the parent gets confusing because you have nested elements. Well, relative, all of the font sizes will be changing up and down that chain relative to each other. Gets confusing. So just use relative to the root, which is RIM, so root M, relative to the root, and occasionally use VW. All right, so you could browse through this description of this lecture. You could pause the video right here, and you could read through here. It's a pretty good description. All of this is pulled from MDN. We've already learned that you don't have to put like pixels or whatever after 0. If it's 0, you don't have to include the length unit, right? So we saw margin 0 auto. We've learned that. And there's this thing of length values. It's a CSS data type, which includes pixels and rem and that type of a thing. So it lists all of them out here. You could go look at it, but don't be confused. There's a whole bunch of them. We're just going to be using rem and pixel for other units of measurement and VW, but for font, just rem and VW, right? And there's different CSS properties that take length values. And length values, which is that, are different than percentages. People get those confused. Percentage is not a length CSS data type, right? So that's just something to point out. Anyhow, those are just some of the nuances of the documentation. I want you to be aware of them. The main takeaway from this video is we're using rem for font size, and occasionally we'll use VW.